Today I'm mainly going to talk about the Apple II because we're celebrating the 40th birthday of the Apple II just about 2 weeks ago. The Apple II was introduced on April 15th, 1977 at the first West Coast Computer Fair. So my story begins there. I was a first-year grad student in computer science at UC Berkeley, and was interested in the microcomputers when they were first starting out, but the Altair and the IMSI, the very earliest ones, just weren't for me because I wasn't handy enough with a soldering iron. But I was looking to get my own computer. It was in the air. I knew it would be soon when they had the first West Coast Computer Fair in San Francisco. Took Bart over to it, and it strikes me seeing the exhibit here today. It's not that different than the first West Coast Computer Fair 40 years ago. I wouldn't be surprised if even some of the same computers are on display there. But just like you guys, it was driven by love rather than financial considerations. People were there because it was their passion, and so it was really thrilling to me to join this gathering of people who didn't really even know they existed. It was sort of like a first gathering of the clans, and there were I walked into the exhibit hall. There were hordes of people running around, dozens of different computers on display, but I was drawn to the Apple exhibit with the colorful Apple logo in there. This was where the Apple II was originally announced. And I saw it was essentially love at first sight. When I approached Apple's booth, it was being demonstrated by what looked like a 12-year-old kid. Was kind of surprised someone so young. It turned out he was actually 16. A fellow named Chris Espinoza, Apple employee number 8. But the early Apple team had two young kids on it. Randy Wigington was the other one. But Chris, I'll talk about Chris a little more later. But the Apple II just seemed head and shoulders above everything else to me with its color graphics. And it's amazing, beautiful plastic case, while most of the others were still in rectangular metal boxes. But it was very, very exciting. The only problem was, at that time, a 4K Apple II at the show there cost $1,795, which was about 120% of my life savings. So, even though I wanted it as bad as I ever wanted anything, its price made it inaccessible to me. So I went through a period of about 6 months where I just was mooning over the Apple II. I'd go almost every Saturday. I'd take Bart to the San Francisco Computerland, which was one of the few Apple dealers in the area, and just hang out and stare at it. And there were usually when I went to the store there were 4 or 5 other people just like me. Couldn't quite afford it, but was fascinated by it. And every week it seemed like there was something new, some newer piece of software, something making it great. And some of the people hanging out at the store were older than me and were able to afford their Apple IIs, but they still came back to the store every weekend to see what was the latest stuff. New programs were coming out every day. It was a very exciting time. But finally, in January 1978, about 6 months after the Apple II went on sale, it was announced at that first West Coast Computer Fair, April 15th. They didn't really go on sale until June or July. But so about 6 months later, they announced a $400 off sale. The price had dropped a little bit in the meanwhile to $16.95, but the $400 off sale in January 1978 dropped it down to $12.95, which got it into the range of being like 95% of my life savings. So I was able to spring for it. But I learned one of the first lessons I learned about the computer industry. Turns out a month later, in February of 1978, they permanently had dropped the price to $11.95, $100 cheaper than I got. So I learned the lesson that I'm sure all you guys knew, although it's no longer really true. But for most of the last 40 years, if you waited, you got a better computer for a lower price. But still, it wasn't worth it to wait because they were so exciting, useful, and valuable to people. So I got my Apple II home, and the first thing I did with it, taking it out of the box, was just turning it on, turning it off, because I never had the power to do that on a computer before. I was a grad student in computer science. I started programming in high school, so I had programmed a lot of computers, but I never had enough control over one that I could turn it off. So that was a big milestone, that it was actually mine. And that first Apple II felt like an artifact from the future. It was both so beautiful, and as I explored it, I saw an amazing creativity in almost every nook and cranny of it. So I started spending most of my free time exploring the Apple II, and then it sort of gradually took over my life, spending most of my not-so-free time exploring all the various aspects of the system. And as I dug into it, it became clear to me that this wasn't an ordinary product. It was the work of a passionate artist. It just reeked of creativity just about everywhere you look. The very first thing, and one of the things that drew me to it, was what was called the high-res graphics screen. That was 280 pixels by 192 pixels, which was pretty much what NTSC, the color television standard, could do at the time. We called it high-res graphics back in the day. Today, it wouldn't even be an icon on iOS, the entire screen of the Apple II. But at the time, it was really sort of the best you could do on a color TV screen. But quickly, I saw there was something amazing going on, because the Apple II had 4 colors, so that's 2 bits per pixel, as well as 280 by 192. You multiply that out and you do the math, and it requires a 12K frame buffer. But the Apple II only had an 8K frame buffer. So it's like, what's going on here? And it turns out Steve Wozniak, the designer of the Apple II, did an incredibly clever trick of clocking the basic machine at the color burst frequency for color TVs, so the graphics was synchronous with the color TV signal, and so you could sort of microprogram it and control the colors just by the positions of the pixels. The way the Apple II high-res screen worked was if you turned on an odd pixel, it was blue, an even pixel was green. So in fact, it was really the mystery was that it was only 1 bit per pixel, but you could control the colors by placing the pixels exactly. I just thought that was amazing. But it had all these other incredible features for the time, like the game paddles. It had a little 16-pin connector that was called Game I/O that allowed up to 4 potentiometers for game paddles, buttons associated with each one. But it was really, you could see right away, it was a hacker's machine. It had a breadboard area. The Apple II wasn't even completed in its way. It had a little area for you to add your own chips, but it also had 8 slots with pre-decoded I/O. It used to be like the S100 bus standard. You'd have to put all the logic for figuring out what your board do on your board, making the boards bulky and expensive. The Apple II pre-coded the I/O, so each slot just had a select signal, allowing the cards to be simple and cheap. And then amazing, the Apple II had 2K of firmware in a built-in monitor ROM. It actually had 6K of firmware. 4K was Woz's brilliant integer basic The other 2K was a monitor ROM, the closest thing it had to an operating system at the time. But it was full of amazing creative tools that Steve Wozniak put in there really for himself. The most notable ones, and the ones most important to me, was it had a built-in disassembler, which encouraged you to explore. You could disassemble the ROM itself or any software you got. But even better than that, it had a mini assembler. If it used the address F666, Woz's favorite number. In fact, when the Apple I originally went on sale, it was priced at $666, the number of the beast, I guess. But anyway, Woz used F666, his favorite address there, to invoke the mini assembler. You just type F666G into the monitor. You got a little assembler that let you build your own code with no other tools except what was built into the Apple II. And I think that really helped set the spirit and encourage software developers. And then the Apple II had an amazing spirit behind it. It had an it just projected an audacious sense of infinite horizons, as if the Apple II could do anything if you were just clever enough. And plenty of people were really, really clever. Even though the Apple II was overflowing with technical and marketing genius, the best thing about it, at least to me, was the spirit of its creation. Much like the spirit here today at the Vintage Computer Festival. People were driven by their passion. The Apple II wasn't a product in the ordinary sense. It was Steve Wozniak trying to impress first himself and his friends. Most of the early Apple employees were their own ideal customers. They were making something that they really wanted for themselves. And I think that was really the secret behind the passion and the greatness of it. The Apple II was simultaneously a work of art and the fulfillment of a dream. Woz had dreamed about his own computer since he was a high school kid. And the Apple II was a realization of it, not just for him, but for all the customers. And so, being a programmer, of course, I was fascinated with the technical details, and I started teaching myself about the Apple II system. Mike Scott, the original president of Apple, put together a book of documentation that became known as the Red Book, the fabled Red Book. When I bought my Apple II, the Red Book hadn't come out yet. It was but in the box were some mimeographed pages that later evolved into the book. I think the Red Book came out about 4 or 5 months after I bought my Apple II. Apple was nice enough to mail one to all of their existing customers. And the main thing in the Red Book was the source listing of the monitor ROM in the Apple II. In those days, there was no abstraction for the monitor ROM, or very little anyway. You just use the hardwired addresses. And some of those, even though it's been 40 years, some of those addresses are still in my head. Probably will stay there till I'm gone. So I started learning 6502 programming. The Apple II was based on the 6502 chip. And I started learning it from Woz's idiosyncratic coding style in the monitor ROM. Probably not the best, in some ways, the best possible way to learn, because the code was so creative and original in its techniques, but it certainly wasn't the mainstream way to program. But I knew that I needed to get my hands on the 6502 manual. Though these days it's so different with the internet. Everything is at your fingertips. But back in 1978, I looked for months just to get the programming manual for the 6502, but was thwarted. I couldn't find one until the second West Coast Computer Fair rolled around in, I believe, September of 1978. That was in San Jose. I went down there, and my mission was to find a 6502 programming manual. I knew at the computer fair there had to be one somewhere. There was some publishing company, I can't remember their name, but they had a big table full of technical books, and I went through there and I found it. I found the MOS Technology 6502 programming manual, what I was looking for months and months and months. And so I went to buy it, but their booth was too crowded. It was surrounded by so many enthusiasts that I couldn't find anyone to take my money. After waited for a half hour trying to see how I could pay for this. It cost $15, it said on the book. I ended up stealing it. Just because it was too chaotic to find someone to take my money. So anyway, that helped me. Waz's 6502 coding style was a bit weird. Finally, I had the manual. I knew how to really do it. So and I started writing programs. Some people actually wrote Apple II software just with the mini assembler. The cottage industry was popping up at the time. One of the great game programmers was a fellow named Nasser Jabeli. I can't remember the names of these games, but practically every week he'd have a great new high-res game. But when you started disassembling his games, you'd see they were written a little bit strangely. There'd be these empty areas of memory that had nothing in them. It turns out he wrote it with the mini assembler. He had no source code. So he left spaces just to patch, because you'd have inevitable bugs. You needed to have some empty space interspersed in the code because he didn't really have an assembler. But meanwhile, I continued hanging out at the computer store. I started writing my own games and demo programs in BASIC. The very first one I wrote was I called it Mother's Little Helper. It played the Rolling Stones song, Mother's Little Helper. It was, in a way, I picked that song because it mocked the original Apple II ad, which had a husband balancing his checkbook on the kitchen table while his wife adoringly stared at him doing the dishes in the kitchen there. Thought Mother's Little Helper was appropriate. The Apple II didn't have any real dedicated sound hardware except for one memory address, CO30. When you reference the memory address CO30, it clicked the speaker. But that was enough to make music and eventually even to make the Apple II talk because you could control the frequency that you clicked you reference CO30, so you could make musical notes and eventually play back digitized sounds. So anyway, enough people had got in their Apple II now that there was a community of people, and we decided to form a club, which I believe was the first Apple II hobbyist group in the Bay Area, possibly the first. I actually think there was one in Seattle that was a little bit earlier. Might have been the second one in the country or the world. It was called the San Francisco Apple Corps, and its first meeting was April Fool's Day, 1978, an echo of Apple itself, which was also founded on April Fool's Day, the previous, 2 years prior. And so sort of the main mission, just like you guys group, a very, very similar hobbyist type club where one of the central efforts was putting out a newsletter and there were some fairly talented people. Bruce Tognazzini, who's pretty well known in the industry now, was one of those early people who helped organize the club. There wasn't a software market yet, though. Everyone just gave away their programs for free. And I remember staying up. The club meetings were Saturday mornings. So usually the previous Friday night, I was up all night just polishing whatever programs I had written the last month, just to give them away at the club. It turns out the Apple II mass storage in those days, the first half of 1978, was cassette tape based. Again, Woz spent hardly any hardware, but he had just a little threshold detector so you could, and an audio input jack, so you could play, essentially encode your bits on the cassette tape using 1 kilohertz and 2 kilohertz frequencies for the ones and zeros, but it really wasn't that reliable. Often, people joked about it all the time, you had to load the cassette tape 3 or 4 times before you finally got the beep that told you that it loaded okay. And a little bit frustrating. I remember complaining to a guy at the club saying, hey, it's so unreliable, I have to load everything 2 or 3 times. And he said, oh, I know what's wrong. Your tape recorder is out of alignment, and I know how to align it for you. So he came back to my apartment at Berkeley afterwards and got out his screwdriver and said he was going to align my cassette recorder, adjusted it, and made it so that I could no longer read any of my of my saved programs. He was very apologetic, but I learned a lesson that I was able to get all the programs I wrote back because I had given them to the club. So I just, like anyone from the club, was able to get copies back. So it wasn't a total disaster. But it was clear that the Apple II wasn't going to be all that good for business applications with the cassette recorder as its mass storage. Meanwhile, at the club, I had started meeting some of the early Apple people. I wrote a fellow named Bob Bishop, who had gotten his Apple II about 6 months before mine, a brilliant, brilliant programmer who worked at JPL before he eventually came to work at Apple. He told me at the computer club he was making, this was probably about August 1978, he was making $7,000 a month selling his Apple II games. I thought, wow, that's decent money in the software market. Meanwhile, the games were being sold on cassette tapes and little baggies that were at the different computer stores. Very, very beginnings of the software industry. Nothing was very professional yet. Also at the Apple Core Club, I met a guy named John Draper, who was kind of notorious in tech circles at the time. He was one of the first phone freaks. He figured out in the early 70s that Captain Crunch cereal boxes came with a whistle that happened to be the frequency 2600 cycles per second, which was used for controlling the phone network. So by playing your Captain Crunch whistle at the appropriate time, you can make free phone calls all over the world. And so John Draper had the sort of pseudonym Captain Crunch. And he was quite the wild character, but he knew Steve Wozniak. He told me he did, and he'd introduced me to Steve Wozniak, who would come to the next meeting. That was really thrilling for me. As I was exploring the Apple II, I just lionized Woz. He became my hero, almost like a mythical figure. It was amazing that I was gonna actually meet him. So this was the August. In the July meeting, I think, Draper told me Woz was going to come to the August meeting. So I got there early and stood by the door, figuring I could pick out Woz just by the glint in his eye. And I did, even though I had never seen a picture of him. I was able to recognize him when he came in, something about his body language, or maybe he was just radiating his genius or something. I was thrilled that at the end of that meeting, I ended up going to lunch with Woz and John Draper to a place in Berkeley called Larry Blake's, where I remember I was just so impressed by Woz and Draper. I hardly said anything, but I listened to them conversing about their plans to take over communication satellites. Woz had a prank. Woz was an incredible prankster, and he was going to play on all 3 networks at once, some funny little gag he had or something. Draper was talking about the technical means to take over the satellites, and meanwhile I was sitting there thinking, am I going to get arrested for attending this lunch? But, you know, I started writing more and more software for the Apple II, getting down to a lower level. And believe it or not, in the time frame of 1978, the Apple II was so forward-looking and so full of amazing features, but one of the features Woz forgot to put in the Apple II, the original Apple II, was lowercase letters. You'd think, you know, it's just so amazing to these days. Well, somehow the thinking was it was better to have flashing uppercase letters than lowercase letters. The coding space where the lowercase letters would be was used to flash letters. Probably not the best design decision, but I realized that I could use the high-res screen of the Apple II. You could draw anything. It had essentially the same resolution as the text screen, so you could use that to add lowercase letters to the Apple II. That in combination with some of the hooks in the monitor ROM that allowed software, you could store an address in low memory that would get invoked every time a character was entered or outputted. So you could just sit in those hooks and use the high-res graphics screen to create a lowercase letter text mode for the Apple II. So I was pretty excited by that, and I started thinking of all these other cool features. I was able to achieve color letters by designing the font carefully enough so it would use the weird Apple II high-res colors to make legible color letters. Some other features. I was just going to give it away. I had, meanwhile, started publishing programs occasionally in the hobbyist magazines that were springing up. There was one of the prominent ones was called Call Apple, but one of my favorite ones was called Dr. Dobbs Journal, and I was an avid reader of Dr. Dobbs Journal, and Woz had published an article in Dr. Dobbs Journal a few months prior about another one of the great crazy little innovations in the Apple II called Sweet 16. The Apple II monitor ROM actually had a virtual 16-bit computer, an interpreter for it, called Sweet 16. And Woz had written an article about Sweet 16 in Dr. Dobbs Journal. I read the article and thought, boy, you know, that's just so amazing. I ought to write a program in Sweet 16. So I wrote a program I called Lazarus that resurrected dead integer basic programs. It turns out that you could be writing a long program, but if you accidentally hit Control-C, it would erase your program, which would be very, very frustrating if it was a 100-line plus program. And I realized that, hey, erasing the program, it just reset the pointers to where the program was. The program's still in memory. So I could scan through memory and fish it out and restore dead integer basic programs. So I called my resurrection program Lazarus. I wrote it in that interpreted Sweet 16 language. Because Woz had written his article about Sweet 16 itself in Dr. Dobbs Journal, I figured I'd write an article about Lazarus and send it off to Dr. Dobbs. So I did, and I figured they'd send me either an acceptance letter or a rejection letter. And so I waited, and after 5 weeks, I still hadn't heard from them. I figured, oh boy, I wasn't even important enough to get a rejection letter to my article. But the 6th week, a box came in the mail, and it was a box filled with 6 copies of Dr. Dobbs Journal with my article published in it. They didn't bother to send me any kind of acknowledgement. They just sent me a bunch of issues with it. So that was really thrilling. My article was, in a way, a homage to Woz. Woz had a bunch of jokes in his Sweet 16 article, so I put a joke in my Lazarus article. Everywhere Woz put a joke in his Sweet 16 article, just a slavish sort of homage. Anyway, back to my lowercase letters for the Apple II. I was going to publish that in Dr. Dobbs Journal, It was a fairly elaborate system program, about 2 kbytes worth of 6502 assembly language, which sounds really, really tiny now, but was pretty substantial back in the day. But meanwhile, I also, at UC Berkeley, I was a teaching assistant. I was responsible for the self-paced introductory programming at Berkeley. One of my students was Chris Espinoza, Apple employee number 8, who had left Apple to get a degree at UC Berkeley. But another one of my students was a fellow named Barney Stone, who was also an Apple II hobbyist. He was very impressed by my lowercase letter program when I showed it to him, and he said, "What are you going to do with it?" And I said, "I would just publish it in Dr. Dobbs." He goes, "Are you crazy? We could sell it, and you could make $10,000. And I thought about it for a while and thought, geez, why not? But I had no idea how to do anything like that. So Barney proposed to me, hey, you just write the program. That's all you have to do. I'll do everything else. We'll split the money. Sounded like a good deal to me. So we started. Barney, I was way too shy to do anything like this, but Barney was confident enough that he called up all the little, not all of them, but one at a time, the little microcomputer publishing companies that were springing up around the Bay Area as more and more of the Apple IIs were sold. And so we had some meetings with these companies. We'd show them my program, and they'd say, yeah, we'll sell it. And it made us think, oh, they must be too small, to actually want our program. So after going to 3 or 4 of the little companies, we finally made our way to Apple Computer. We made an appointment to show Apple my lowercase letter program to see if they wanted to publish it. I had told Chris, who had worked at Apple, I was going to go down and demo my program to Steve Jobs. He said, be careful. If he doesn't like it, he'll bite your head off. It's exactly what he said. I wanted my head to remain attached, so I was a little bit wary. But Barney and I went down to Apple, must have been early December 1978, met with Steve, and he was incredibly nice to us, just the opposite of what we were led to expect. And I was totally blown away when he said Apple wanted to buy my program. Just like a dream. But then about a week or two later, Steve's assistant at the time, a guy named John Couch, called me up and said, we changed our mind. Kind of disappointing, but they had a pretty good reason. The idea behind my program, since lowercase letters wanted to be used with every program, my idea was to burn a ROM that would go in one of the there were 2 empty ROM sockets on the original Apple II board, the D0 and D8 address space sockets, and my program was going to be a chip in one of those, but Apple said, oh, we decided to switch over to what we're going to call the Apple II Plus, which will have floating point basic in those ROM slots. There's no more empty ROM slots, so we can't really use your program. But then he ended the conversation with, but we want to hire you. And I kind of thought, boy, working at Apple, like a dream come true. But I had put at that point 2.5 years into getting my PhD at UC Berkeley. Passed my prelims and everything, quite an arduous process. I'm thinking, well, it's my dream to work at Apple, but I shouldn't just throw away 3 years of work, so I'll stay and get a master's degree. I'd already taken all the courses I needed for a master's degree. I just had to write a master's thesis. So I told John Couch on the phone there, let me get my degree, I'll start in June. And so I did. But it turns out Apple II had these cliffs in the way they were compensating people giving out the stock. And so starting 6 months later, I missed a 4-to-1 stock split. I would have gotten 4 times as much stock if I had started earlier. If you do the math on that these days, it's just a staggering amount of money. Even back in the day, it was millions of dollars. Today, with the amazing successes of Apple, that was probably hundreds of millions of dollars that my master's degree cost me. And it was totally useless in every other way. There's absolutely no benefit from it. So I do recommend going to school. I'm not sure about the degree part, though. Although, you know, a lot of different situations. So anyway, I stayed. I wrote my master's thesis. I went to the 5th West Coast Computer Fair. By that time was June of 1979, and I ran into Steve Jobs just walking there. He goes, "Hey, how come I haven't seen you at Apple yet? You know, you said you were going to start." And so that spurred me into, he gave me some phone number to call. They arranged interviews. But when I went down to interview at Apple, I was very, very disappointed because I was totally head over heels in love with the Apple II and obsessed with it. And thought going down to Apple, it's like going to Mecca, you know, the source of all the secrets. But as I interviewed these people whose job it was every day to write software for either the Apple II or some of the later computers Apple was developing to follow it up, they disrespected the Apple II. They didn't like the Apple II. They considered it their job to make Apple professional. The Apple II was too much of a hobbyist, chaotic thing for them. So I was pretty disappointed that hey, the programmers at Apple don't even like the Apple II. Till finally, the very last guy who interviewed me, a guy named Dick Houston, who I think was at this club a few years ago. But Dick was the fellow who wrote the boot ROM for the Apple II floppy disk, which I was, by that time, totally obsessed with how the floppy disk worked, which was in a very, very strange way. I'll talk more about that later. But especially the boot ROM, because the core routines that drove the disk couldn't fit in the 256 bytes. Those Apple II cards had a ROM space of most of them only 256 bytes. It's hard to believe today. That's not even a Macintosh icon. It's worth of data. But he started explaining to me some of the tricks in the boot ROM, which was exactly what I was looking for from the interview, learning these amazing secrets, and that got me enthusiastic about working at Apple, and I started there in August of 1979. I became a systems programmer at Apple, and my first project they put me on was totally thrilling. It was writing the firmware for a small thermal printer they had under development called the Silent Type. And the idea was, the reason it was so thrilling to me was it did kind of the same thing to printers what Apple had done with the disk drive that I was so enamored with, which was back in the day, most of the disk controllers for microcomputers required their own microprocessor. Usually they were 40 or 50 chips. I bet you we have some of those machines on display out there today. You'd see a large board with 40 chips just to be the disk controller. Well, what was figured out is you could sort of rip all that stuff out and just use the microprocessor of the Apple II to do all the controlling. So it reduced something that was on the order of 3 or 4 dozen chips down to just a handful, 6 or 7 chips, by using the intelligence already in the Apple II. So we were doing the same thing for this thermal printer. The way it worked was it had a printhead with 7 elements on it, and software controlled whether or not electrical current was sent to each of those 7 elements at any given time. So you can heat them up, and when they were hot enough, meanwhile the printhead would also move horizontally across the page, and you'd make little dots depending on if you had the printhead heated up or not. You had to maintain a thermal model of how hot it was, and so, you know, a little bit complicated but fun. But Vic Bull, the hardware engineer, was worried about software crashing or getting hung, leaving voltage going to the printhead, and then potentially starting a fire. So he explained to me in his design, when he was telling me initially how it worked, he put in a special timer to make it so none of the printhead elements could be left on for more than 10 milliseconds. So it was fireproof. So the first thing I started thinking about was, hey, starting a fire sounds pretty cool. What would happen if you left it on for 9.99 milliseconds, turned it off for a handful of microseconds, kept it back on? So effectively, the timer prevented it from being on for more than 10 milliseconds, but it didn't prevent it from on for being seconds as long as you turned it off for a few microseconds every once in a while. So it was very, very satisfying to write that program, try it, and see the printer burst into open flames. That's some hot software there. Unfortunately, it destroyed the printhead doing that. So kind of expensive demo, but I kept that one by my desk just to have my flame demo I could show whenever. It was no good for printing, but it was still worked at setting paper on fire. And it was very, very satisfying to be able to develop that printer, and within 4 months of me starting working on it, it was actually in the computer stores. An incredible thrill to see something that I helped create for sale on the stores. I remember I grew up on the East Coast, even though I was living in California. That Christmas, I went home and I took my kid brother, who's 10 years younger than me, over to the store to show him the product that I created. Was a very, very thrilling time. I could probably go on for a long time. I got to watch my time here, but I have a few stories I really want to get around to. But so anyway, coming to Apple, it was like ascending Mount Olympus, hobnobbing with the gods, my heroes who worked at Apple. And one of the best parts, I was amazed starting at Apple. I had a desk that was just 2 desks away from Steve Wozniak. And it was amazing to watch him. Woz didn't really ever work. He just sort of played. When I first started at Apple, he was working on a project to calculate the mathematical constant E to 100,000 digits, which he thought could be the world record at the time. And so he wrote his program. He used a very clever algorithm that had no intermediate results, so that all of the Apple II's memory could just held one big number, including the memory devoted to the graphics screen. So you could see as it was iterating, every once in a while the screen would change, so you knew it kept running. It was calculated that it would take 8 days to run. But his Apple II was a little flaky, possibly because it was one of the early prototypes. So it kind of crashed after about 5 days usually. So it took, for about a month, he was working just on calculating E. The disk drive is what I want to focus on now, because I think that was really Woz's crowning achievement, the Apple II disk drive, the last major piece of the Apple II to be developed. He started working on it in the fall of 1978, and he was incented to finish it really fast because Apple was going to be demoing at the Consumer Electronics Show in January of 1979, which was in Las Vegas, which was one of Woz's favorite places. He had never been to Las Vegas, but he really wanted to go, so that kept him up for nights at a time getting the disc ready for Las Vegas. So they flew to Las Vegas, they got to the hotel room, still tinkering with the software, and right before going to bed, the night before the big demo, they decided they better back up the software now that it was all working. So they did, but they realized it was just Woz working with Randy Wigington. They realized they had copied the blank disk onto the disk with the code. So about 12 hours before the demo, they lost it all. They had overwritten their only copy of it, but it was still fresh in Woz's memory, he just stayed up all night and got it all working again in time for the show. But the disc was an incredible achievement. It was literally had about 1/4 of the parts costs of most of the floppy disk controllers of the time, but yet it had about 30% more storage density. It was better in every way, as well as being about 1/4 of the price, which is an amazing thing to achieve. And he did that by using the microprocessor of the Apple II to control the disk at a very low level. And it ended up the disk controller. I saw one of the disk controller cards. You guys have it out there on display. One of the things that I think is a great example of his artistry is he decided, he laid out the PC board. There were 8 chips on the disk controller card. He laid it out himself and noticed that what he thought there were too many feed-throughs on the printed circuit board. A feed-through is a tiny little hole that routes signals from one side of the card, the front to the back. And feed-throughs, they cost a little bit. I think they cost 1/5 of a cent. So not really very much, but Woz decided to minimize the feed-through. So he laid out the board again and again and again to get it down to, I think, just 2 feed-throughs. Just really artistic motivation, not really technical or business. But having a great disk drive elevated the Apple II above all the competition, made it a useful business tool, and sales started taking off as it became, as microcomputers for the very first time became useful in ordinary companies. And the program that really changed things was called VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet, which was available only for the Apple II. When VisiCalc came out in the fall of 1979, Apple's sales started tripling every single month for a period of time. Their sales went up by about a factor of 30 or 40, sales of the Apple II, in the course of 1980. But VisiCalc, it turns out, was one of the very first copy-protected programs because it had real business value. Woz got a copy of VisiCalc, loved it, and was really excited he wanted to show it to his brother Mark, who ran a computer store nearby Apple, but was chagrined when we found out he couldn't copy the disk. But of course, Woz, being the architect of the disk drive, well, that wasn't going to stop him for long. He started disassembling the VisiCalc program. He saw where they made just a tiny little change to the disk format, which was the thing that prevented the normal disk routines from copying it. Made a patch so you could copy the program, but as he was disassembling through VisiCalc to figure out, what the change he had to make it copyable, he noticed that the floating point math routines were not coded so great. It looked like they were not really written for the 6502. They were inefficient. So along with breaking the copy protection, he put in his own floating point math routines that improved the calculation speed of VisiCalc a factor of 3. Kind of useful. And he made a program to patch VisiCalc to remove the copy protection, speed up the math. He called it VisiCrook. Was his first foray into breaking copy protection. But then, a little bit of time passed, and every week there were new programs coming out, and now most of them started being copy protected because they figured, I think wrongly, but the thing was, well, people wouldn't pay for it if they could copy it for free. And so Woz got tired he didn't want to have to disassemble every program to break it. So I saw him one morning. I came into work. He was in the hardware lab at Apple, busily wire wrapping a card. Woz wouldn't really be in the lab much, but when he was, he worked incredibly fast. I asked him what he was working on, and he said, "Oh, I'm writing a nibble copy." What he as designer of the disk drive, he knew he could copy any disk by going beneath the disk format level and just copying at the transition level, the magnetic transitions on the disk. The problem was the disk controller card didn't really give 100% of the disk transition information back to the microprocessor. It used some of it for syncing. So he made a little card that let him capture every single transition so he could make a transition level copy, and in a day or so, he had a copy program that would copy protected programs. No sweat. And it had the added benefit of the copies themselves were still copy protected. So Woz kind of had this magic copy factory that no one else could really use, and was quite satisfied with that for a while, but another few weeks passed. And I saw him in the hardware lab again, wiring up a card. I asked him what was going on, and he told me, oh, well, I started thinking, what if I wanted to make a copy-protected program, and someone had my nibble copy? How could I prevent that? And so he's fighting the copy protection wars against himself at a level of technical sophistication, probably an order of magnitude or two more than anyone else out there. But he decided he needed to figure out how to protect against his own nibble copy. And so he realized the fatal flaw of the nibble copy, copying at the disk transition level instead of the disk format level, is that it couldn't detect soft errors. There's an error rate associated with every disk, even today, but you have checksums, so you could say, hey, an error occurred, I can retry. But because the nibble copy copied at below the level of disk format, it couldn't make any assumptions about disk format. So if there were an error, the copy would be useless. So Woz realized he could introduce soft errors, make disks with a very high level of soft errors. So he made a card that stretched the disk transitions were either 4 microseconds or 8 microseconds for a 0 or a 1. Well, he made a card that made 6 microsecond transitions. So they'd be equally likely to be read as a 1 or a 0. He put a little potentiometer on his card that controlled the percentage of transitions that were made into 6 microsecond transitions. So he essentially could control the soft error rate. So he called this card Fuzzbox, because it sort of fuzzed up the data, and sure enough, he was able to thwart the nibble copy. Disks that were processed through Fuzzbox could not be copied with the nibble copy. There were just too many soft errors. So I thought, boy, this is just amazing work, even though no one really wanted it. But I came into work a couple weeks later, and I noticed an acrid stench emanating from Woz's cubicle. Walked over there, and I saw he had a laundry iron plugged into the wall, and he was ironing disks together and melting them. I said, what are you doing? What's going on? And he said, well, I started thinking, what if someone had my Fuzzbox and I wanted to copy the disks? What can I do? And he said, I realized if I could heat the disk up to the Curie point where magnetism would transfer. Turns out there's some principle of physics I didn't even know about, but you should be able to copy a disk by heating it to the right temperature. So he got his laundry iron from home, spent a day just ironing disks together to see if he could get them to copy. But instead, more often than not, he would melt them. And they'd be goopy, and it would have this horrible smell. So finally, after he was working that on a day, I made the mistake of saying, hey, Woz, I bet you $50 you'll never get that to work. And he quickly put out his hand and said, it's a bet! So I knew something was wrong. But in a day or two, he had stopped, took the laundry iron home. He had seemingly given up. So I said to him, hey, Woz, I guess you owe me $50. He goes, no, I don't. I'm still trying. It turns out I phrased my bet using the word never. I said, you'd never get that to work. And he realized, well, never will never happen, right? Because he can always say, He's still trying. So to this day, I think he's still trying because I never got my $50. So I could go on, but getting to the hour, so maybe I'll just open it up for questions.
It's kind of a sad topic, but I'm very interested in Burl Smith. It's like, can you talk about what's going on with him now?
Sure. Burl's my best friend. Working with him on the Mac, we bought 2 houses on one lot in Palo Alto 30-some years ago. But unfortunately, in 1989, I actually know the exact date, April 4th, 1989, Burl became schizophrenic, freaked out, came over to my house naked and was talking to God and stuff. It was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, seeing your best friend suddenly be crazy. And he's been, luckily, I helped him start a company, Radius, that made large screen displays for the Mac a couple years before that. So he's financially secure and still living in the house in Palo Alto, but sort of a hermit. He won't even talk to me. I can try when I try to get him to talk to me, and he's very uncomfortable. So, sad story. Burl's a genius. Was amazing hardware designer. But creativity and madness have some kind of link, and unfortunately, Burl, flipped out.
Are you excited now with software and technology?
Well, mobile devices, I think, as an old computer guy, been doing this for coming on 40 years, I'm in heaven, nirvana, just with everything really now, but things smaller, faster. Today, I think the most exciting thing to me is mixed reality, where you have glasses that'll superimpose images on your eyes. So, like, for example, if I had such a thing and was wearing it now, I'd see a little name tag under each of you, so I could have called you by your name or stuff. And you see, so they're nascent platforms. They're not really going to come into full flower for another 4 or 5 years, but I think that's a very exciting direction. The other is deep learning or machine learning. Just the industry has made incredible progress after considering it an almost intractable problem for years, doing things like perfect speech recognition or picking out the objects in a photo and writing a caption for it. That's all, over the last few years, new techniques have made incredible breakthroughs where we can do stuff like that. So having natural interfaces, I think at Amazon's Echo product is a fantastic type thing. Just ambient intelligence in your environment, that's really going to change the world. So myself, for my own programming, I'm retired, but I still dabbled for my own amusement, and so I've been enamored with something called 3GAS, which does 3D graphics in the web browser in a really easy way. So I'm playing around with both physics simulations and 3D graphics in the web browser. Yeah, every once in a while I do things like, but it turns out I learned a long time ago. It's much easier to write something for yourself. You just if you're writing something just for yourself, you do all the fun parts basically, and you don't do the parts that aren't fun. But if you want to try to make a product, you have to do a lot of the work is not the fun part. So I try to stay away from that.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be yours, but as a coder, what is your all-time favorite Easter egg?
It's a good question. There's been my all-time favorite, I gotta say, actually, that the Ken Thompson hack he put into the original C compiler just to propagate itself, essentially a virus that when it compiled C into the C compiler executable, something like that. That's a classic thing that's amazing. But the design teams, like It's not really an Easter egg. I tell the story in my book, though, about the stolen from Apple icon. While we were working on the Mac, someone cloned the Apple II. I think I saw a copy of that out there, the Franklin Ace, where they just took the Apple II and they copied every chip. They copied all the firmware. They defended themselves in court by saying, oh, it's just software is just a mechanism. You know, there's nothing creative there. Everything. Apple was scared they were going to win that lawsuit, or Apple would lose the lawsuit and anyone could copy the Apple II. Luckily, Apple prevailed. This was in 1980 when the laws were still less clear. But so anyway, because of that experience with the Apple II being cloned, we decided to put a secret Easter egg in the Mac where there'd be an icon that said "stolen from Apple." It was an icon of a prisoner behind bars. And so we built that in there. That was Steve's idea. He wanted something like that. So he wanted to be able to go to a trial where the competitor cloned the Mac, be able to walk up to it, type 4 characters, just an address, and display on the screen, "stolen from Apple." That would have been a very dramatic court demonstration. Unfortunately, I don't think it ever really happened. Although some people were obsessed it leaked out that we had something in there, and one guy in particular was obsessed at finding it. And for a few years, every time he saw me, he said, "Oh, I think I found it." And it wasn't right until finally he did.
Two things. One, read your book twice. Absolutely awesome. Love it, love it, love it. After all the years of programming, do you have a favorite language that you used?
It changed over time, and I program in whatever language is most appropriate for the project. But if I had to sort of a clean slate and whatever, these days I prefer programming in Python. Is just, I think, beautiful and expressive and simple. So I really like that. But I actually do most of my programming these days is for the web browser, so I use JavaScript, which I wouldn't say is my favorite, but I love programming in JavaScript. Yeah?
The movies about Steve Jobs and the documentaries characterize the time of the development of the Macintosh as being pretty high pressure and maybe not always the most pleasant. Can you comment about your time there and your experience with that?
I loved working on the Macintosh. It was very high pressure, but we believed so strongly in what we were doing. We had a really tight team that all loved each other. So it was like, even though we worked around the clock, it was play as much as it was work. We dropped the distinction between work and play. So I think really what it is we believed so strongly in what we were doing that it was a joy most of the time. Now there were some bad situations at different times. I wouldn't say the whole thing was a joyride, but the pressure, in hindsight, it had as much good to it as bad to it. And depending on your personality, some people couldn't work well in such an environment, whereas others thrived in it. I was one of the ones who thrived.
Hearing you talk about the Apple IIe times brought back a lot of memories, I think, for a lot of us. Do you think there's a certain form of artistry, if like what Steve Wozniak was doing, what you were doing, that's just been lost because we're all programming on such a different level today? I mean, working on JavaScript, that's what we do today because nobody sits down anymore and tries to get a disk drive to be optimized by going in the audio channel. But do you think there's something that has been lost with that?
Sure. Something's been lost, but more's been gained. I think the amazing thing about being a programmer today is a potential audience of billions of people using your work. You work at a company like Apple, say you're working on the next revision of iOS. You have 1 billion people. That's just amazing. 4 orders of magnitude more than we could have had on the original Mac. And then there's plenty of low-level tasks still. Someone still has to bring up new microprocessors, new boards, so people do the low-level stuff. There's just not so much memory pressure, which allows us, and the processors are so much faster, we could focus more on the direct benefit to the user, which is a good thing. And then there's still, especially in the UI design, where it meets the human, is a great area for artistry. And still the industry doesn't do good enough. I wish we had better art of that kind. But I think being a programmer today can be, not necessarily, but can be just as artistic as it ever was.
Assuming you've seen all or some of them, are there any? Are there any? There's a plethora of biopics and movies about Steve Jobs and Apple's history. Is there any one or two in particular that strikes you as being as close to reality?
I have to say my favorite one. I had an experience with that most recent one that came out 2015. Just the one, I think it was just called Steve Jobs, the one based on Walter's book. I got to be involved in the process of making that film because there was a character based on me. I got to meet the actors and stuff. So that was an amazing inside experience at seeing a major film developing. But I wouldn't recommend that as one of the better ones. It was just the conceit of Aaron Sorkin, who is a brilliant, brilliant screenwriter, chose a way of structuring that movie that made it all not really true. You know, his conceit was it all took place in the 40 minutes prior to 3 different product introductions, which of course in real life things didn't happen that way. So it kind of undermined it in terms of it being realistic, even though I think the dialogues is at times hilarious. There's real poignant scenes, so there's stuff to recommend it, but the fact that so much of it is contrived in a way that wasn't consistent with reality undermines it. So I would say my answer of all the movies about Apple, the one that I liked the best was actually a made-for-TV movie from 1999 called, now the names, Pirates of Silicon Valley. I thought the screenwriter there was brilliant. Noah Wiley played Steve Jobs. I think he did just a totally brilliant job. I flew down to Los Angeles with Woz to meet the guy who played him in it, a guy named Peter someone. So we had a pleasant afternoon with him there. But my favorite scene in that movie, that movie was really about the conflict between Apple and Microsoft, and it told parallel stories of the beginnings of Apple, the beginnings of Microsoft, but focusing on the conflict between Apple and Microsoft, especially over Microsoft doing Windows. My favorite scene at the very, very end of the movie, Steve confronts Bill Gates after he found out they sort of betrayed us by doing Windows at the time they were working on the Macintosh software. And Steve tells the Bill Gates character, he goes, well, we're still better. Our stuff is way better. And then the Bill Gates character kind of looks at him, smirks a little bit, and says, you don't get it, Steve. That doesn't matter. I thought that really captured a good truth there. Yeah?
Sorry. I want to ask the opposite of her question. What terrifies you the most about the way things are going now, as far as the tech industry, internet?
The Trump administration. I think that's the most terrifying thing I've seen in my lifetime. But their effect on, I won't go into it. But it really is the scariest thing. I'm pretty much an optimist in terms of the technology, and even human beings with their drive to make things better. Tech is going to improve lives, like take the self-driving cars, which are on the horizon. That's literally going to save tens of thousands of lives a year. Although, I guess the terrifying stuff, again, getting a little bit into politics, is just the way that information can be hacked and spread around. You know, there's some scenarios there that are terrifying, like hacking the nuclear codes or whatever, or the power grid. That's truly terrifying.
So real quickly, I'd like to clarify for the younger generation, the thing that he called a newsletter is just a printed blog. That's all it is.
Yes.
So I'd like to thank Andy for coming out and spending time with us today.
Thank you.